Everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, How Hackers Run Circles Around Our Defenses. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Bryce Galbraith, SANS instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Bryce.
Thanks so much, Carol. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining today. Always admire people that take the time out of their busy schedule to join these webcasts and attend the at-night talks at our events and things. It's just always a humbling experience to think that you'll take time out just to listen, just in case you might learn something interesting along the way. So thank you for coming. My name is Bryce Galbraith. Been doing this stuff for quite some time. I'm not here to talk about myself. If you want to check out my background, you can check it out on the SANS website. But let's just say I've been a 25+ year combatant in this thing that we call information warfare, and it's been an amazing journey. And I've got some interesting things to share with you all today. I often get asked as I'm traveling around doing consulting and teaching, how is it that attackers do these things? How is it that they get around things like encryption and our next-gen firewalls and this multi-factor authentication and smart cards and biometrics? And, people are genuinely perplexed a lot of times about how this is even possible. And so, when we're teaching these courses and when we travel around and do this stuff, we're often trying to explain some of these tools and tactics and procedures, TTPs, that attackers use. And so I thought it'd be good to put together a nice webcast. It's going to be fast. It's going to be pretty full. But I wanted just to try to get as much of this out as we can in the short window of opportunity that we have right here, so that hopefully people will be more equipped to deal with these adversarial forces. All right, so let's get started without any further ado. There's a quote that I absolutely love. I use it a lot when I'm presenting. I just love this quote from the movie Sneakers from '92. I'm sure some of you have heard this one before. But the world isn't run by weapons anymore, or energy, or money. It's run by little ones and zeros, little bits of data. It's all just electrons. There's a war out there, and it's not about who's got the most bullets. It's about who controls the information, what we see, what we hear, how we work, what we think. It's all about the information. I just love that quote because never before in the history of the world has it been more relevant. And every day when I wake up, I'm like, man, it just keeps getting more true every single day. And the stakes are higher than they've ever been. And more than ever, we need people who really understand the adversary so that they can actually defend against these adversarial forces, all right? And you have to ask yourself, who is it exactly that's after this information? Information is powerful. And, there's this type of information is so powerful, it's going to bring out the biggest superpowers of the world and some of the most advanced people and adversarial forces the world has ever really known. And so when you think about who might be coming after your stuff, we call them APTs, advanced persistent threats. I sometimes call them advanced persistent thieves, just because a lot of times it does involve breaking in and stealing information from various organizations to try to get this information. Now, there's a lot of players in this space, and we can argue who the good guys and the bad guys are, which is an interesting conversation. But I think it's safe to say that some of these folks are going to be the most capable groups that the world has ever really known. It's hard to know who it is exactly that's coming after your stuff, which is why we have this great little attribution dice right down here. We can just roll that and try to figure out who it is that might be trying to hack our stuff. Right? But in the meantime, we have to try to defend against this. And when you really stop and consider the capabilities of these advanced adversaries, it is significant. Virtually unlimited resources. They have, in many cases, they have direct access to your electrons through the partnerships with the telecommunications companies and cloud providers and different things of that nature. So they don't even necessarily have to hack in. They've got direct access to the communications in many cases, cellular networks and fiber optics and just the internet as a whole. Seem to have a never-ending list of exploits and backdoors. They've got elaborate anonymization and command and control infrastructures. And even if you do happen to somehow magically attribute somebody, one of these actions to a particular group or an individual, in many cases they have immunity from prosecution because, after all, it's state-sponsored. So if you're going to try to do any sort of prosecution, you're most likely going to have to go through their own government, and they are the ones that are sponsoring the activity. So that seems to be a dead end with any kind of legal action. The plausible deniability, even if you do catch them, they just don't admit it or just even lie about it. And they can often operate outside the law or just change it to suit their purposes. These are not your typical adversaries. These are not just your run-of-the-mill organized crime folks or even some of the more advanced ones. And they're certainly not some of the regular script kiddies that we sometimes see in the movies and things. They're also highly, highly motivated, maybe conditioned as well. They feel it's their right, an obligation, even a duty, and they all have their own justifications. Now, you look at the list, everybody on that list feels like they're the ones that are the good guys. And many of the other folks on the list are considered to be the quote unquote bad guys. That's a different topic. That's not what we're here to talk about at all. The 7 layers of the OSI model. That gets into layers 8, 9, and 10, which is politics, funding, and then ultimately philosophy above that. That's not what this is about. You pick whoever's on this list you think might be your adversary. If they're coming after your stuff, they've got considerable capabilities, and then we're supposed to defend against that. And it can be really challenging too, because we're often running with limited staff. Basically, the opposite of everything on this list is where we are on the defense. Trying to defend against these adversaries, and it can be really tough, but we don't give up. We fight. That's where we're in this fight. Many of you fight this fight every single day, and you're not just going to back down. You're going to continue to fight to try to protect your ones and zeros. And that's why we have things like the next-gen products, and all these advanced capabilities that are out there today. These products are the best they have ever been in the history of the world. Some of these vendors and some of the people and the brains behind some of these products are just absolutely astounding. I mean, the things that they come up with, and the technologies that they implement, and the capabilities, and the sheer volume of data they're able to process. I mean, there's some amazing stuff going on with these products, and we need them. We need the most advanced products that are available for us in this fight, because much like in the movie and the story, in the picture here, we're often fighting against a significantly overwhelming force. We need all the advantages that we can get. So, we get kind of excited. We go out, we read things like the Magic Quadrants from Gartner and the Forrester report, and we try to figure out, which products do we need, which ones are designed to defend against the advanced adversaries, and so forth. And then we try to implement them into our actual network, all right, which unfortunately, for many organizations, looks a lot like this. It's kind of like going out and getting the Nextgen gate, to try to protect the house. And that gate might actually be the best gate that was ever invented in the history of the world. And we could go on and on about the gate. We could talk about its features and its function. We could even compare it to all the other gates and, basically prove, maybe subjectively, but we can prove that that probably is the best gate that money can buy. And, we put that gate in front of our organization, and we somehow sometimes think that that's gonna protect us from some of these advanced adversaries. But much like this house, putting a next-gen gate in front of it is not necessarily going to be enough. And if I was trying to break into this house, or if somebody was trying to break into this house, what other opportunities might they have to just completely circumvent and bypass the gate entirely? All right. So, and the real mind bender with this whole thing is when you actually become aware that these advanced adversarial forces actually have exploits for the next-gen firewalls and next-gen products themselves. And if you think about that for a minute, that can be kind of demoralizing. You're like, wait a minute, you mean they have exploits that can actually break into the next-gen product itself? And the answer is yes. And it shouldn't really surprise us. I don't know if anybody's ever worked at a small company, startup, that kind of thing. They often operate loose and free. Everybody's got local admin rights. They don't necessarily have the best policies and procedures in place, and they're not necessarily focused on defending against APTs. They're trying to make payroll. They're trying to, not run out of angel funding while they can get this product going. Trying to compete in a very highly competitive market. Try to get to market before the others and try to win the position in the Magic Quadrant and things like that. And it's a real mind bender when you realize that they might very well literally be inside your next-gen firewall. I mean, the irony is thick. You're like, wait a minute, that's just not right. But see, there's really no rules in hacking. It's just varying degrees of efficiency. And what's more efficient than breaking into your actual network devices and using those as staging areas and listening posts and various things of that nature? So if you weren't already aware of that, you need to be. because awareness is absolutely key in this. And I'll tell you, the adversarial forces, they love three things about us. They love the fact that many times we're going to have ignorance. Now, this is not a bad thing. Sometimes this just has a negative connotation. All this really means is lack of knowledge or information. You can't possibly know it all. There's just way too much to know. And so the problem here, though, is that when you've got these advanced adversaries with the incredible resources and human capital and technologies and funding and stuff that they have, it is very likely they're going to know stuff that we don't. And so whenever you know something, especially an offensive tactic or something that the defensive team does not know about, that puts you in a hugely advantageous position. And that's kind of where we're at. They love our ignorance. We're going to have it. We just have to strive really hard to try to minimize our ignorance. We have to understand our adversaries. Sometimes you'll run into people that think they know everything, but they probably might suffer from the second one here, which is overconfidence. This plays out in many, many different ways. But we hear things like this, well, that's encrypted. That data is encrypted. They often end that sentence with a period. And experience has told me that is just the beginning of the conversation. We say things like it's encrypted. Hackers say things like, well, where's the key? And they go after the key. They don't really care about the encryption. They just go after the key. We hear this a lot too. It's behind the firewall, period. And a lot of the data that gets stolen is actually behind the firewall. So there must be more to that whole story too. Most people have IDS, IPS, they have security operations centers. They put a lot of faith in these things sometimes. Some are very good, others not so good. And we hear things like this too. Well, yeah, we got rid of passwords. We use multi-factor authentication, or we use smart cards, or we use biometrics, or DNA samples from the movie Gattaca or something along those lines. Or or they're compliant with some restrictive standard or something. And sometimes this turns into overconfidence. Not always, but occasionally. We just have to be really careful, because if we get overly confident about our defenses, we get overly confident about a particular technology like a next-gen product or something, or we get overly confident about our own passwords or authentication system or software or anything, that actually puts us in a weakened position as well. As the saying goes, pride goeth before the fall. So be very, very careful not to be too confident. It's good to have a healthy skepticism on these things. And then this last one here, apathy. Hackers absolutely love our apathy. And this plays out many, many, many different ways. Count the ways that this plays out. I'm sure many of you have stories about just how incredibly apathetic some people in your own organization might be towards these things. My favorite one of all is, well, why would anybody come after me? Okay. That could also be this one, ignorance in some cases. And we like to help them understand why they're being targeted and how they're being targeted. So hopefully we can overcome some of the apathy. But this is an ongoing struggle. And as we struggle through all these three things in our own organizations, hackers, they have no sympathy for us whatsoever. And they just attack us without mercy. All right, so Sun Tzu in The Art of War had this figured out centuries ago. One of his famous writings had to do with knowing your enemy and how important that was. So the purpose of this talk is, how do these hackers do what they do? How is it that they get around all these defenses that we have? And so I love this diagram from the Advanced Persistent Threat article down at Wikipedia. It's a fantastic article, and there's this nice little wheel in here. I think SecureWorks actually developed this a long time ago. But this is my favorite illustration of the way this goes down. I'm going to hit on some highlights, and then we're going to look at some specific tools, and I'll even do some demonstrations so you can see some of these things for yourself. But the first thing they have to do is define the target. And let's just suffice to say that every industry sector in existence is being targeted by at least one APT, or maybe advanced organized crime group or another. Okay, and most likely there's more than one that's targeting them. They find and organize accomplices. These are the most advanced adversaries the world has ever known. The most capable, the most skilled. They have the most people, literally entire groups and teams and even militaries in these groups. They also partner with third-party contractors and things all around the world. Each of these APT groups is doing this kind of thing. So we're talking some serious capabilities here. They have incredible tools. You think about it, a lot of the nations have basically weaponized the entire telecommunications infrastructure, at the very least turning it into a surveillance apparatus. But in many cases, in an increasingly rapid rate, they're also turning this into an exploitation platform. All right. Now, they do a lot of recon research, open source intelligence gathering. Plus, when you're dealing with nation states, they have the collective knowledge of their entire intelligence community that they can bring to bear on this problem. And they're going to research the target organization and the people employees, contractors, and people that are part of the organization. That is a very, very key part of it. It's all about people at the end of the day. And very often they will target specific people that have information that they're interested in, especially administrators. Make no mistake about it, nation state hunt administrators. Okay, they will do reconnaissance and figure out who has access to what. And then once they get in, they will start targeting these people, possibly even at home. They're even known to attack the schools and things where the kids go that have parents that work at the organization that have the information that they want. So, they go after whatever they can to get whatever information they feel they need. And it's just important to know, I'm not trying to scare you, but if you are an administrator at an organization that's being targeted by an advanced persistent threat, you are probably literally on a list somewhere and probably being targeted either directly or maybe indirectly if they feel you're a bit more savvy. All right. Now, I'm not trying to scare you, but that's important to know because they know that administrators have access to the things that they need. And so if they can get access to the administrator's credentials or even just their security context, which I'll explore here in a moment, they don't even necessarily need your password. They will then try to get access to that so they can achieve access to the information they're really after. All right. They're also going to do reconnaissance on some of the key players and administrators in different technologies. So like who's in charge of the Windows AD. They can just look at LinkedIn profiles. They don't even have to get real crazy with intel gathering to figure this out. LinkedIn profile is usually all you need to look at. They'll figure out who has access to the main databases they're after because it's on their LinkedIn profile. They'll look at who's on the network team based on Cisco certs and Juniper certs, and who's on their Windows team based on Microsoft certs, and who's in charge of their virtual machine infrastructure based on VMware certs and social media posts of them at VMware or World and different things like that. They'll also figure out who are their security team. They'll do reconnaissance on them to figure out, well, how good are these folks? How much background do they really have? Are they really on top of things, or are they just sort of winging it, or what's going on over there? And they might even look to see if you have GX certifications and things of that nature, because that'll help them understand who is on the defensive team. All right. Now, they also test for detection before they ever deploy. I think this is really important for us to grasp. When you're dealing with nation states, they're going to have big labs where they have a lot of these products. They're going to have the endpoint security suites. They're going to have the next-gen firewalls. They're going to have SIMs and all these different things that they know they're going to be going up against. And they're going to test in their lab before they ever deploy to make sure they can bypass a lot of the common technologies. And that's assuming they don't actually have exploits for the gate itself. Going back to this little meme here, they might actually have not only bypass techniques, but outright exploits for it. That is not off the table. Okay, that is entirely possible and even likely. And we've seen examples of it, so it's not even theory. Now, when it comes to deployment, very often they'll have entire teams dedicated to your organization. The more higher value target you are, the bigger the teams. Okay? And they have division of labor, highly organized, objective focused. And we're not just talking regular script kiddies running Nmap here. Okay, we're talking serious teams, including human assets, spies and things that might be able to infiltrate physically into the organization or drop media or plant implants and various things of that nature. Okay. Now, when it comes to the initial intrusion, they have a lot of options. They do prefer spear phishing just because it tends to be easier. Spear phishing and watering hole attacks and things of that nature. They often have 0 days, undisclosed vulnerabilities in client applications that they can just take advantage of. It's like a master key. If you've ever seen one of these actually work, it's pretty much like magic. You just go from no access to access. And they have them. They have lots of these. They have a continual stream of these undisclosed vulnerabilities in 0 days. There's an entire market for this too, by the way, where people create and sell these exploits to various APT groups around the world, usually whoever they feel are the good guys or whoever's the highest bidder, depending on if they're ethically flexible or not, all right? Now, they have super advanced malware, the most advanced malware we've ever seen. There's even backdoors. I don't know if you saw this recently, but there were 700 million Android phones that were discovered to have malware in the firmware on the phones that came directly from the factory, which is supply chain infiltration, part of a giant information operation, most likely from China. That's where the phones came from. 700 million, I mean, that's nearly 1/10 of the world's population, okay, with one information operation, with just one specific instance of firmware malware. And this thing would dutifully report back to every 72 hours with all your contacts, your GPS location, unique identifiers on the phone itself. And then they can analyze all that to figure out who's in your contacts and figure out if you are a target or not, or if somebody you know is a target. And then one of the things they can do with the malware is deploy additional malware. So they can turn on your microphone and web cameras and different things of that nature. Okay, there's even malware that uses the gyroscope in your phone to keep track of all the geometry involved in the angles of your phone during the day. And it can just use the camera to take snapshots at different angles all throughout the day, send all those photos back to the mothership so that all the photos can be reassembled. They end up with a high definition photo of the inside of your facility, for instance. So I mean, and that was just one example of one specific firmware on 700 million phones. And there's been other examples of this too, all right? So the chances of supply chain infiltration, even shipping interdiction, and implanting of implants and various things is not only possible, it is going on, and even on a massive scale, all right? Actual human assets, human spies, many times they'll actually work at the company. It's unfortunate. There have been many that have been caught. There are probably many others. Kind of like speeding, you only get a ticket once in a while. You might speed a lot. Chances are there's spies all over the place. Only a few have been caught because they are professional spies after all. And so they might very well work in the target organization or get some kind of access. Okay. Also just flat out coercion. Like I imagine the company that made those phones in China didn't necessarily do that on their own. They were probably coerced, possibly cooperated, but they were probably coerced. And I think this is another thing to be aware of. Many times these nation states, they have the power to be able to coerce a company into cooperating. Coercion is not exactly cooperation, but they like to call it cooperating and partnerships and things, where they can get the vendor to do their bidding. Either give them source code or feed all of the vulnerabilities and exploits that are discovered through them first so they can weaponize the ones they want to keep, and so forth and so on. It's also lawfare, just use the law. Oftentimes they'll just change the law. If it doesn't suit their purposes, they'll just change it to where it does. And then they can legally do what they were doing before illegally. All right. So it's a really interesting dynamic. Now, again, is this right? Is this wrong? Is this good? Is this bad? Well, that's a whole different topic. We're focusing on how they do what they do. And these are some of the really important initial intrusion techniques. All right. Now, eventually, though, they're usually going to need to control it one way or another. And this is often done with an outbound initiated connection of some kind. This may go through your perimeter to the internet, but it may not. It doesn't have to. Just like that quote earlier from Cosmo, it's all just electrons at the end of the day. So yeah, it could go through your perimeter, and we like it when it does because it gives us more opportunities to try to defend against that. But it doesn't have to. I mean, do some Googling around on some of the other techniques that are there. There's something called bad bias that actually uses the computer speaker in the motherboard to be able to transmit data acoustically at inaudible frequency ranges, so you can cross over air gaps and stuff. There was one recently I kind of got a kick out of the name. It's called Magneto, and it actually can pass through Faraday cages, which are designed to block radio frequency RF transmissions. But it does it because it's using magnets instead. So they call it Magneto, which I got a kick out of, given the recent comic book movies recently. But it's not funny if that happens to your environment. An Israeli company even figured out how to cause the video card, has nothing to do with wireless, cause the video card to oscillate at a frequency that just happens to be used by the 3G cellular network, and they could literally transmit data through the video card oscillation and pick it up on the cellular network outside the facility. So to say that to think that we're going to catch all that through our perimeter with our next-gen perimeter firewall or something, that may not necessarily be the entire picture. And that's important to note. This one here, the next one, expanding access and obtaining credentials. This is such an important one. Oh my gosh. The more you can learn about the way this is done, the more equipped you'll be to defend against these adversaries, because many organizations are very much unaware at just how fast this whole thing can go down. In fact, Microsoft actually just released something that I thought was very timely. They said, based on their experience, it only takes between 24 and 48 hours from the point of entry, the initial intrusion, to completely own the organization, okay, based on their experiences. And then Mandiant, FireEye just came out with a document recently saying that the average dwell time for the attackers before they ever even get noticed is, I forget the number offhand, but I want to say it was 99 days. Anyway, it was quite a while before they ever get caught. And then there's many that are actually there for years and years. Occasionally one of these will be discovered and we find out it's been there for years and years and nobody even noticed it. Okay, so key logging. I often ask my clients, how long would it take to own your organization if an adversary had a keylogger running on your admin's workstation? It's a really uncomfortable question, but I think it's very appropriate because that's exactly what will happen. These advanced operators actually like to operate on the administrator's workstation because they know they can maintain access that way. RAM scraping, I'll show you an example of some of these later. RAM scraping can pull passwords, it can pull encryption keys or decryption keys that can be used to decrypt data. Security access token impersonation, one of my own personal favorites when I'm illustrating these risks to my clients. This is actually taking advantage of the access token that is generated after you authenticate. So very often organizations confuse authentication and session management. They're very different things. So they focus on strong authentication, use smart cards and biometrics and so forth. Hackers come along and say, yeah, that's pretty good, but I'm just going to steal the security access token that represents your authenticated session, and I'm going to run off with it. And I'll show you how that works. Password managers, most people that have to deal with very many passwords, they use these, which is not a bad thing. But do you think that nation states know about these and how they might go about getting these? I'll show you an example of that here in a minute too. Service accounts, everybody's got them in the Windows environment. The problem with these though is that since it is tied to a service, the service cannot type in the password when it starts. And so the password has to be stored locally on the machine in a different fashion. Now it is encrypted, but the key that's used to decrypt it is actually in memory. So when you use a RAM scraping tool, you can steal the key that's used to decrypt the encrypted service account password. And then these are usually highly privileged, often domain admin, and the hackers can run off with those. Pass the hash has worked since 1997, still does today. And taking advantage of the way Windows authentication traffic works over the network, the hacker doesn't even need to crack your password. They never even need to know what it was or is. They can still potentially authenticate and deploy payloads or just access data on the other system. And if you're not using some of the sort of legacy network authentication protocols that pass the hash leverages, like NTLM v1 and v2, pass the ticket can work inside of the Windows Active Directory Kerberos realm. And then one of the total ponages is this thing called the golden ticket. There's also the silver ticket, which is not quite as widely known. That's very dangerous as well. But the attackers are able to basically grant themselves this thing called a golden ticket based on the Willy Wonka, and it basically has access to everything inside of the Windows AD, and it has a lifespan of 10 years. And if that's not long enough, you can actually extend that. Okay, talk about persistent. That's going to be a long-term penetration access of your organization. Some of the pivoting that can be done is pretty remarkable too. So one workstation might get compromised, but the hackers can literally terminate an entire VPN tunnel to the workstation and have complete access to everything that's on that LAN segment as well as the inside of the network. And very often they can even perform things like ARP cache poisoning, which is a layer 2 data link style attack. But when you can bridge your Ethernet frames from halfway around the planet over a VPN tunnel, you can actually perform man-in-the-middle attacks through these pivots as well. And the lateral movement techniques, this is a really big one. A lot of these allow for extensive lateral movement. So you might just have an initial intrusion with one system, but using all these variety of attacks, they can usually expand access very, very, very quickly. And then they can basically just go around the horn. They've done their recon already. They know who the administrators are for the various technologies. Most of them are going to be on a Windows workstation most of the time. So once they've achieved domain admin rights, they don't even have to be domain admin. They can just query the Active Directory and say, hey, where is this user logged in from right now? And once they figure that out, they can then use the lateral movement techniques to just move over onto that administrator's workstation. And next thing you know, your technologies just topple left and right. Just go around the horn. Like, okay, we got the AD, let's take out the virtual machine environment. Let's take out the Unix environment because they're often on a Windows machine using terminals and things. Or maybe they have a VM on their workstation that's Unix. Let's go after the network devices. So they go after the people that have, the CCNAs and CCNPs and CCIEs and so forth, and Juniper certs. And then even the cloud, somebody's got to administer cloud resources. So they'll try to figure out who they are and then take over their credentials, and then they can potentially take over whatever you might be hosting in the cloud. It's scary how fast this can go. There's even this thing called the DP API. This is the data protection API. This has to do with a lot of the Windows crypto libraries. that third-party applications can use to try to protect information. There's an entire framework called the DPAPING, Next Generation, that is designed to extract these keys that are involved with the data protection APIs and extract all those keys, and then they're able to take all those keys and use those to decrypt anything that's encrypted with those keys. Remember we like to say it's encrypted, but the hacker just says, where's the key? Classic hacker mindset. Now, with all of this, strengthening their foothold is more or less a byproduct at this point. They're going to have so many creds and access to so much stuff that's sort of a given. The real trick is finding what they're after and then packaging it all up so that they can exfiltrate it. Had an acquaintance friend of mine who they dealt with a 25 terabyte data exfiltration incident. Now they happened to find it post attack by doing some data visualization tools on NetFlow data, and one of the graphs, when they visualized it just sort of popped out. They're like, oh crap. It was so clear as day when they saw it on that one graph. But when they got to analyzing that, the hackers had actually registered over 1,000 unique domains for this exfil. And they, not only that, but the amount of data in each one of the exfils to each one of those unique places was just underneath the threshold for the product they have that looks for exfiltration, indicating they had probably already gotten into it. Because a lot of these security consoles have web interfaces from the admin's workstation, and they use self-signed certs and so forth. So, getting into the devices is not very hard. And so they knew exactly what the threshold was, which was not the default. So they had to have been in there somehow. And they got in there and made sure it just stayed right underneath the threshold. And then as far as covering your tracks, a lot of the exploitation, post-exploitation, so they get in with some kind of exploit. But a lot of the post-exploitation, as they work around this curve here, is done using stolen credentials in security context. And they just use built-in features, legitimate features and functions of the operating system, normal protocols, SMB, RDP, SSH, and so forth, HTTP and HTTPS, using legitimate credentials. And so this looks very different than traditional exploitation would. And the more advanced attackers even go so far as to have anti-digital forensics and incident response techniques, all right? Now, I know that's a lot, and it can be overwhelming. And security is hard. It is very, very hard to do properly. It requires huge commitment, requires considerable resources, and probably the most important of all, above all else, it actually requires understanding. This to me is one of the most important things. This is actually one of the reasons I'm a SANS instructor. This is one of the reasons I like doing consulting, is that I want to work as closely as possible with as many people as I possibly can to try to help them understand as much as I can help them with. And I don't claim to know everything, that is for sure, but I want to try to convey as much of my understanding as I possibly can to as many people as I possibly can, so that hopefully we can defend this information just that much better. But I can tell you, it can be overwhelming and daunting. I see it in people's faces when I'm talking to them and working with clients, and especially when I do pen tests and I get around all these defenses that are just like, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you just did that. And it can be overwhelming. And if and when it all goes bad and all that stuff goes out the door, who is ultimately to blame? And that's really frustrating. And if you're an IT person, or you're in a leadership role, or you're trying to deal with this stuff and risk management or auditing or whatever role you are in, it is frustrating. So then the question really is, what do you do about it? And so we don't want to focus just on fear, doom, and gloom and all that, but what do you do? Well, a lot of organizations do the best they can. They try to fight the fight and try to keep the bad guys out. But a lot of increasingly organizations are realizing, wow, I don't know that we have the capability to sufficiently protect this data. Why don't we just move it? Put it out in the cloud. And that actually makes a lot of sense for a lot of organizations. I mean, these cloud providers, they have some absolutely brilliant folks that work there. They have incredible data centers. They've got policy and procedure and physical controls, and just truly remarkable infrastructures. I'm impressed by the cloud providers. I truly am. And in many cases, your data might actually be safer there. It's harder for attackers potentially, because hopefully they're doing a better job of securing it, at least in concept. There's quantifiable cost savings, no doubt about it. Users love it too. They love the freedom, especially if you allow BYOD, bring your own device. projects and stuff, teams and stuff. They're so happy. Team collaboration and stuff is really remarkable with this stuff. And even the leadership team is often quite happy with it too, because they see that they're saving money and people seem to be happy, and they've done something very important in the risk management world, which is transfer risk. Because now if it gets hacked, well, it was the cloud provider. That has real value when you're responsible for all this kind of stuff. Right now, the trouble with this though is that even though we can get pretty excited about it and it can help our organization, and in many ways it might actually help protect the data more than if we try to do it ourselves. The real problem with all this though is that these ones and zeros, they don't stay there. If all of our data actually stayed in this cloud, it might actually be better, but it doesn't stay there. That's the real problem here. This is the part that people don't sometimes think about. Because meanwhile, while we're trying to secure all that data up in the cloud, whatever that is, it's really just other computers elsewhere. But while we move it up in there and hope that it's better, we forget about the user sometimes. Bring your own device. I sometimes call it bring your own destruction, because I think we forget. We're like, no, wait a minute, what about the endpoint? We got all these people out there with whatever device they happen to have and whatever state it may be in. And I don't mean state, I mean condition it might be in. 700 million Android phones have that firmware malware in them. And that's just one example. There's been others even more recently since then. You got all this malware that could be on any one of these devices. Last time I looked, only 2% of Android devices actually have the latest version of Android. There's a lot of reasons for that, but at the end of the day, that opens up a lot of opportunities for attackers. And BYOD pretty much says, yeah, just bring your own device. We know your local admin, you have total control over it, and we don't have any control really. And we know you're going to hook up to whatever free Wi-Fi you can find. And we know there's gaping holes in the SS7 and the whole cellular network that can be attacked. And you're going to plug into whatever network you happen to be on, whether it's free Wi-Fi at McDonald's or AT, wherever it may be. And your system might have any who knows what on it. And the users are going to be doing whatever they do. What could possibly go wrong? Because after all, it's in the cloud, right? Well, it would be okay if it stayed there, maybe. Okay. Do a Google search on the Cloud Act that's about to be passed right now, though, which actually is an interesting one, and what that does to data in your cloud. But I think the endpoint is really the issue. I did a presentation at a cloud security conference once, and they didn't invite me back because I focused on this particular area. The title of the talk was "Client Access is the Achilles heel of the Cloud." But the attendees did a rating, and they rated it the highest talk in the whole event. But the hosts that were the cloud providers didn't really want to talk about that aspect of it, which I understand, because after all, they're the ones that do the cloud. The endpoint is not really their thing. But this all creates an interesting environment for the attackers. All right. Now, say what you will about this guy here, Ed Snowden. Some people think he's a hero, some people think he's a traitor, but he made a point that I think is useful for everybody. He said, one of the quotes that he made that really caught my attention was, endpoint security is terrifically weak. Now, of all the word choices he could have used, terrifically weak, that's a lot of emphasis. So if we've got an endpoint that is terrifically weak, that is then trying to access the information that's in the cloud, what kind of opportunities does that open up? Now, I'm going to go through these quickly. You can look at these later and Google all this stuff later, because I want to get to my demos and have time for Q&A. But there are so many attacks that are potentially possible. Many of these work in the enterprise, but most of them will work with mobile users, especially in BYOD in particular. But physical attacks, if you have physical access, you can do direct memory access attacks. Very often there's very sensitive things in memory like keys and password hashes and all sorts of things. And very often through these high-speed peripherals, you can actually attack it via DMA, which is actually a feature, ironically, which allows for direct memory access. The name is what it implies. Cold boot attack, Google that one. That can actually be used to bypass disk encryption. The con boot, this is a really interesting boot disk that can bypass the entire authentication process for Windows and Mac OS. And you can just go right in as an admin and just completely circumvent it. It actually boots first, and then it loads the actual target kernel from the real one. But once it's in memory, it actually overwrites the section of code that handles authentication and said, yeah, we used to need a password or something, but not anymore. Just come straight in, super user. Rubber ducky, these little guys are amazing. They look like USB flash storage, but when you plug them in, the system sees it as a keyboard, and it's preloaded with the attack. There's a whole bunch of attacks that can be loaded, and it does it very, very quickly. It types it very, very quickly without any typos, which I wish I could do. And this works on Windows, Linux, Mac, even BSDs and other Unixes and things. The land turtle, this thing is nasty. You definitely should look that one up if you've not seen it. You plug that into the network. It actually has an Ethernet adapter on the back you can't see here. But this thing is a smart USB adapter, and it can do man-in-the-middle attacks, and it's just amazing the things that it can do. Persistent remote access and open VPN tunnels with bridging of Ethernet frames and reverse SSH tunnels. And the Bash Bunny is our newest one. It actually combines several of these features into a nice little portable Linux distro that boots up in seconds. The Evil Maid attack, Google that one too. This is another potential attack vector against things like disk encryption, because I travel a lot, and I've actually devised some techniques to tell if somebody's come in my room without authorization, and it happens regularly. I should put it in here. There's a new app called the Haven app where you can take an old Android phone and just dedicate it to this. You run the Haven app, and it uses all of the sensors, light sensors, motion sensors, cameras, everything, to detect unauthorized access to your room, and then it sends it off to you remotely. Even if they take the phone, it's too late. You've got it all. And it has happened numerous times now. And then flat out theft, just steal it and take it somewhere. Okay, man-in-the-middle attacks, they can ARP cache poison, especially on networks that you don't own, mobile users and BYOD and stuff. And once you have a man-in-the-middle position, it's game on. Okay, I could do a whole nother talk on that one. The cellular networks have just major, major flaws in them as well. Man-in-the-middle, nation in the middle. There's a reason why nations like to either outright control the ISP or maybe have partnerships, because it lets them do things they just wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Very often have direct access to the telecommunications infrastructure, whether it's authorized or not. They will try to achieve that. Name resolution attacks. So when your system tries to resolve the host's names, it won't necessarily be able to, or I should say the hacker can attack these protocols and then be able to give you a fake IP address or a bogus one and redirect your systems. There's all kinds of redirection attacks, DNS spoofing, HTTP request hijacking. You can Google all these and see more about them. Okay, these are some of the techniques and some of the tools that are used. There's inherent issues with the SSL and TLS. Now, we rely on that a lot, especially for cloud access and smartphone apps and things. But even on the inside of our network, very often we'll use SSL or TLS to protect things like web consoles to security appliances and network appliances and SIMs and things of that nature. And a lot of those have self-signed certificates, so it makes it pretty easy to do a man-in-the-middle. But there's been issues like Heartbleed and Poodle and Beast and on it goes. There's these tools like SSL Strip and more currently SSL Strip 2, and there's one called SSL Strip Plus. These actually allow the attacker to strip away the SSL and TLS protections in certain circumstances. Sometimes even when HTTP strict transport security is enabled. That'd be another great webcast, actually. Jason, maybe we'll do that another time. But if you want to watch a video demo, there's a video right here you can check out where the gentleman actually walks through this, and you can see it actually work, even on modern browsers with HSTS enabled. Code injection. One of our favorite tricks is to inject JavaScript-based keyloggers. You can do exploits and steal cookies that have session IDs to bypass authentication. You can modify pages for social engineering. You can do geolocation. It's crazy. This one here, if an attacker is able to get even just a little bit of JavaScript into the victim's browser, they can then use that foothold to tunnel traffic through the victim's browser. So imagine the victim got hit on an open access point somewhere, and then they just close their lid on their laptop, put it in standby mode, hand carried it through physical security, and then opened it back up on the inside of the network. This thing's going to try to phone home. And when it does, it'll allow the attacker to actually come back through that connection and tunnel traffic and start to connect to internal systems, all right, through the victim's browser without actually exploiting their system, really. It's all inside the browser. Just to show you how far this can go, this is a mind bender the first time you see this. This website shows you how to actually deliver an entire Linux distribution written in nothing but JavaScript, which is natively supported by all the browsers, including smart devices. And now you can deploy literally an entire Linux attack platform in the victim's browser. I mean, that'll make you look at the internet different when you see that one, okay? And that's just scratching the surface. Now, we know that we need strong authentication, and I love to see more and more of these sites supporting multi-factor authentication like Google Authenticator and Azure Authenticator and Some people are using the secure ID tokens, and I love that. I absolutely love it, because that does actually provide you with much stronger authentication. But what about after that? There's these thing called session tokens that get stored on the local browser, and then these get issued every time you try to go to a website. It'll actually submit the HTTP request using the session token. If a hacker gets a hold of these using sidejacking techniques, then they can actually bypass strong authentication. We do it regularly to illustrate this risk to our clients so they understand what they're dealing with here. There's a tool called Mimikatz that makes it very easy. Mimikatz is a RAM scraper. Does not require administrative permissions, whereas many of them do. It's just written in PowerShell, which is native to Windows. It just supports regular expressions. So like you'll see over here, this is actually snagging the login credentials for just about any web application that exists on Earth. They're pretty much all just inherently vulnerable to this attack, including the session token, even if you're using multi-factor authentication. Then there's Mimikatz. I'll show you an example of that. And more recently, there's this thing called the DPAPI-NG toolkit. I just tweeted about it if you check out my Twitter account. But this actually attacks the Windows crypto APIs and exposes all sorts of otherwise protected information, not only in Windows, but also third-party applications that use Windows crypto APIs. All right. Now you can get into like certificate authority issues, secret government demanding access, insiders in the cloud, spies working at the cloud, implants, backdoors, 0 days, virtual machine escapes, and even potentially malicious hardware and firmware. And I think this guy had it figured out a long time ago. Okay. And I know when you look at all this kind of stuff, you're like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? This is horrible. All right. But I also want to just not talk. I want to show you a few quick demos so you can see some of this as well. All right. And you're never supposed to do live demos, especially on a webcast with hundreds of people, but that's just the way I roll. So let's do it. So we've got a Windows 10 Enterprise 64-bit edition. We could only hope that all of our users were up to that level. And this thing is fully protected. I actually just made sure this morning that I had all the latest AV on it, all the latest threat definitions. It did a health scan. I mean, this thing has got everything turned on that Windows provides. This has the latest patches, so it even includes the Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit that was rolled in recently. And there is nothing missing on this thing. Okay, I mean, we would just hope that especially our BYOD users were up to this level. That would be wonderful if we could get to this level, okay? Then over here, I like to use Metasploit just because we should be able to stop this from happening by now, but good old Metasploit still works like a charm in many cases. Now you just have to do little modifications, which I've done. I've made little slight modifications and tweaks that allow me to bypass. And I've just set up a multi-handler that when the victim clicks on the wrong thing, it's going to kick off an automatic script that's going to perform several actions on the victim. So I've got my C2 server set up. It's listening on port 443. So this is like your, attacker C2 server on the internet somewhere. Now over here, we've got this highly protected system, including the firewall and application browser control and just everything. I haven't disabled anything on this thing because I like to do it on the latest and greatest versions of the OS, because if that works using these kinds of tools that have been around for ages with just light modifications in them, just imagine what nation states can do. All right, so like over here, you got a typical, like a spear phishing scenario maybe. And so here I just got a little project plan, spreadsheet. This is Office 2016 fully patched. And for this demo, I'm just going to use the traditional macro deployment because that's still one of their favorites. So yeah, it has a macro in it, but if they enable it, boom. Even with all these defenses here, no warning. Everything seems to be fine until you go over here, and then you see that Meterpreter was actually deployed, and now it's kicking off my automatic script that is performing several actions, including taking a screenshot of the desktop on the victim. And there's no warning. Everything looks fine. Now I've set this up in a way where it's not actually tied to Excel either. So even if the person were to exit out of Excel, I've actually taken that into account. So if you just take it, I won't go through all this, so we don't have time for that. But if you just take a quick look in here, you'll see that right in here, Meterpreter session 1 was deployed. It kicked off the auto run script with all my actions in it. Just got a little bit of information like what computer it is, and it's 64-bit and it's Windows 10 and so forth. Unique machine IDs and context. Now right here I had it migrate. So it's migrating out of Explorer and migrating out of Excel and migrating into Explorer. Right. So I've got away from Excel, so I'm not tied to that anymore. And then just looking at interfaces, figuring out, getting oriented, going through the OODA loop, observing, orienting, see what's connected, where it's established, other systems I might want to attack. It's all in there. Here's a route statement, so I can look at routing and network subnets and gateways, so I can figure out where the gateway is and so forth. Date and time, so I know where this thing is probably, at least where its home time is. Different drives that might be on there, so I can go pillage around in there. ARP cache, just to learn about what's on the network. And you can always look at the first 3 bytes of a MAC address to figure out what device it is. So if I were to do that, I'd see this is actually a virtual router, indicating I'm inside of VMware's software-defined networking. Otherwise, it might be like a Cisco or Juniper or something. I had to grab a screenshot. And then this one actually goes and scours on the file system looking for the common password managers. And it figured out that KeyPass is loaded on that one. So it went around and found anything with the KDBX extension on it, and so it automatically downloaded the KeyPass database. So I have a copy of that. And then I'm just running a keylogger for good measure at the end here. And now all the keystrokes are being captured right here. So all I really have to do is go follow that file with tail -f. Anything that gets written to it, I'm going to see. All right, so eventually, this user is going to open up their password manager, like we do, right? And they're going to put in their password. This better be a good one. Because, this has the keys to the kingdom in here, right? The only problem is the attacker just caught that. So 1 password to rule them all. I've already got a copy of the password manager, so now all I have to really do is just do KeyPass X. It's a Linux version of this one. And we'll just go grab that one that's in the directory there. And we'll just open that guy up. And I know what the password is now, so and then I can unlock it just like the users do. And then there's everything that's in that password file, and then I can see the passwords. So like this is the local account admin for emergencies only. All right, well I have an emergency now, I'm gonna have to log in with that one. All right, and then similarly over here, this is like the real secret sauce here. This is the vault. All right. And so when I open that one up, I can see that it's running, it's on a Unix server. And if I were to show you the port scan, there is like nothing running on this thing. It's about as tight as you could ever hope for. And it has SSH running, SSH version 2 only, but it's running on port 2222, not 22. And then there's the password that I will never get, okay, except I just got it. And so, I mean, to think that hackers don't know about password managers isn't probably not the best plan, okay? Now, I just want to show you something else that we can do with this. Once I'm in, I can do webcam, turn on the web camera. You don't want to see my ugly mug, so I have a sticker on my camera, but you'll see that it's actually working here. This is actually the back of the sticker on my camera. I'll spare you looking at but it works, trust me. You can turn on the microphone. You can do all kinds of stuff at that point. Now, if you're one of the people that doesn't actually type your passwords in, you can also do something like this. You can do a clipboard, whoops. You can load in another one, extended API, and you can do clipboard monitor start. This will monitor the clipboard now. So if you're one of the people that doesn't type your passwords in, you might just do copy. Well, I just snagged it. So I can just do a clipboard monitor and then a dump, and then there's the password there. This will capture images, basically anything you put in a clipboard, including network diagrams or emails or whatever you happen to take a picture of, and go from there, all right? Now, it's bad enough that I'm in here. I've already bypassed endpoint security. This is not only because it's Windows Defender. Windows Defender is actually really good, especially at catching things like Meterpreter, but we just know how to modify things a little bit. That's what hackers do. And so I'm in. Now, just to drive this point home just a little bit though, I'm going to get in with elevated privilege because that last one, I didn't actually have elevated privilege. That was just regular user stuff. This one I'm going to run with full admin rights just to show you what they can do. Oops, actually, let me do something here. I'm going to start this again. This time without the automated script because I don't want that to run all the time. And I just want to show you a couple more demos and then we'll wrap things up here. Take some questions. So once I've got that C2 server listening, this time I'm going to run it with full admin rights, just to illustrate what can be done then. So if I go and log into session 2, this one I can actually bump all the way up to system privilege with. Oops. There we go. So if you do a get user ID, you'll see that I've completely compromised that system. I'm running with full system privileges, even though there's no warning or anything at this point. And what we have learned is that we can actually migrate, which is doing in-memory process migration. Actually taking the malware from where it is currently running and actually migrating it over into the local security authority subsystem, all right, which is one of the most highly privileged processes in user mode that exists. And it didn't work this time. So what do hackers do? They just give up, right? No, they just keep trying until they get it working. So let's try this again here. So we'll elevate up to system, and then we'll do migrate and lsas.exe. See if we can get in there. Sometimes it doesn't work the first time. Okay, that time it did. So you do a get UID. I'm running with system privilege. I do a get PID. I'm actually running inside of process ID 672. And if you do a PS minus S to look at all the system level processes, you'll see that process ID 672 is indeed LSAS. So my malware has literally bypassed the AV and is literally running inside of the LSAS process, the most highly privileged process in user mode. Now, just to drive the point home, if you look down at all the other processes that are running in here, let's find something that's actually part of the AV. So this guy right here, you'll see is actually part of Windows Defender, right here. Let's see if we can migrate into Windows Defender. So I'm doing in-memory process migration. We found that if you migrate into LSAS first, you can usually migrate into just about anything else. And I have successfully migrated into the AV itself, right? Just to kind of drive that point home a little bit there. Now, I also want to show you just a couple more things here. So I'm gonna get back in with a fresh one that's not all tied to my migrations and stuff that I did there. Now, if you're using smart cards and biometrics and that sort of thing, they can load in incognito. This actually allows them to look at the security access tokens. So these are generated when you log in, no matter how you log in. Could be DNA samples, it doesn't really care. That's the actual user there. Now, if I do a get UID, let's see, I think I'm already system, yeah. So if I do a get UID, I'm currently running as local system, but if I list out the user tokens, you can see John Doe there. I can actually do what's called SAT impersonation, and I can actually impersonate John Doe and just literally become John Doe. And I don't care what authentication mechanism you do, I'm John Doe now. Okay, and with the beauty of single sign-on and the magic of Active Directory, I have access to everything that John Doe has access to without entering the password, because either does he have to. Okay, and then just another quick example here. Just get back in with a nice fresh one again, because when you migrate around, it changes your security context. So that's why I'm doing that. All right, so once I get in there, now I can also load in things like Mimikatz, which is a RAM scraper. When you do that, you have all these different options that are available to start messing around with Kerberos tickets and creds and different things. You can do W digest. Now this is the latest, greatest version of Windows 10. They've protected some of this stuff in memory. If you do this on an older version of Windows, you'll actually get clear text credentials and things. But they have Kiwi, which is Mimikatz version 2.1.1 now. This is the latest one. And when you do help there, you'll see it can mess with tokens, it can mess with Kerberos tickets, it can even do DC syncs and pull things off the domain controller. You can even try to get the golden ticket. And then this one here, I like LSA dump secrets, so we'll do LSA dump secrets. And this is able to dump out things like the sys key. There's many, many things that are encrypted with the sys key, now they're decrypted, or they could be. This one has the DP API system key, so now you can start to unwind anything that's encrypted using the Windows libraries in Windows. And then just one more real quick here. I've got an entire Windows domain set up over here. I'm just gonna exploit one of these boxes to show you another thing that you might find. So we'll load Kiwi again, and we'll do the LSA secrets again. And service account passwords. So in this case, this is actually a service account, the TPS reports account in the corp domain. And the password is working on Saturday. Now that's a good password that would not crack any using normal techniques, but you don't have to when you can scrape RAM, all right? So they just basically use these techniques. They move laterally, they bounce around the horn, and they hit all your major technologies, and they can just pretty much topple all of your technologies just by using a handful of strategies like that, okay? And there's more, you know, there's always more. I'm already running a little bit late here, so let's move on. You know, and you might be looking at that thinking, oh my gosh, it's completely game over. You feel like that guy in the movie Aliens, you know, when he just like totally gave up. But it's not like that, and that's actually not the point of this. The point is awareness. You know, we want to know what these adversaries are able to do to the absolute best of our abilities. And I want to make sure we realize that they are not invisible. That stuff that I did right there, there's artifacts all over the place. There are things that could be done. There are technologies, there are recommendations, there's hardening steps, there's products, there's technologies that could have shut that down. And if you think about stealth aircraft for a minute, amazing technology, amazing what you can do with smart people and unlimited funds. It's just amazing stuff. But is it actually invisible? Well, no, it's right there. You can totally see it. It's one of the reasons I operate at night. It's got jet engines, there's heat, there's sound, it disrupts the airflow. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to detect it. But in practice, most people don't, because they're just not really tooled and equipped to actually detect it. Well, this is what you really want to take away from this. There is very little, if anything, that an attacker can do that cannot be detected or thwarted, some way or somehow. Repeat that over and over until you start to believe it, okay? Because it's true. The stuff that I just showed you, and even the super elite nation state malware, when it does get discovered and we learn about it, there are things that can be done, okay, to thwart it outright or even detect it once it gets deployed. Every interaction leaves a trace. It's really hard for an attacker to move through your environment without leaving some kind of a trace somewhere. There are ways to disrupt it, and many people are, or I should say some, are already doing it. The question is, are you? Okay, are you doing what needs to be done there? Now, this is mostly focusing on how the attackers do what they do, but there's two main areas to focus on. You have to tailor it to your own environment, but the first one is detecting unauthorized changes, okay, as close to real time as possible. There will be a change somewhere when the attackers do these things. Could be any one of these locations here, or maybe others, but there will be a change. All malware that we've ever discovered, there was some kind of a modification somewhere, including things like supply chain infiltration, where they put it in at the manufacturer, but still, it's going to be somewhere. And the other part is detecting malicious use of legitimate credentials, because when you really look at the attack cycle, most of the post-exploitation activity is going to be done under legitimate credentials or security context. And so anything and everything, products, technologies, process, procedure, anything at all that we can focus on these two primary areas is going to be incredibly helpful, because there will be a change somewhere, just like in the Matrix when the cat walks by twice. It's just a question of, will we detect it or not? Okay, because it's there somewhere. Which really leads us to wrap this up. When you look at organizations, a lot of them have the same gear. I mean, there's a handful of next-gen firewalls, there's a handful of IDS and IPSs, there's a handful of endpoint security suites that people are using. They all pretty much have the same stuff. But like these guys here, I mean, if you were going to send these two to battle, you most definitely would want to equip them, okay, with the best stuff out there. But who's going to probably fare better in battle, with a hardened adversary? This guy over here probably is going to be better. More training, more understanding, more awareness, more strength, physically and mentally, and probably. Now, even with default settings, I mean, if you give somebody the right equipment, I mean, if a flaming dart just happens to hit this thing, well, yeah, it's going to probably stop it. But if you got a hardened adversary that's like, okay, it's on, you're my defense, okay, you're defending against me, well, it's going to be probably short and sweet, okay? Now, what we're trying to do is get to this point here. And what's really the difference if we equip organizations with the same technologies and the same products? The difference is you. I mean, you are the difference. It's one of the reasons I like teaching. It's one of the reasons I do this consulting stuff, is that I have learned over my career, as many of you have, is that it is all about people at the end of the day. We can use all the technologies and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, it is about the people behind the scenes that are making this stuff happen every day. And it's about how well they can wield the technologies. If these two people have the exact same shield, this person can probably wield it better. Maybe they've been in the battle longer and they understand the way the adversary moves. And they can duck and weave and even anticipate some of the attacks that are coming, right? And so I get excited about that. The real question you want to ask yourself, and we all have to ask ourselves this, is how well do you really know your enemy? Because that's what it really boils down to. Because if we don't know the tools and techniques and procedures, the TTPs, that these adversarial forces are using against us on in many cases, a massive scale, we will succumb in battle. And that is what's happening to most organizations. But the good news is it doesn't have to be that way. There are real world things that you can do to defend against these things. You can thwart them, you can detect them in many cases. and we can actually do much, much better in battle, okay, which this is ultimately all about. All right, so with that, Jason, do you have some Q&A? We've got a few minutes here. Sorry, I run a little bit long, but not too bad.
Yeah, I'll go with some high-level questions just due to time.
Okay.
One is, will these slides be made available? And I'm going to answer that and say yes, they will be at sans.org/webcast in the archive of this webcast. So people will be able to download these, and we'll make this available on YouTube so that people can share with colleagues at work as well.
Great.
So I have a question for you. Does forcing administrators to use a virtual desktop provide any benefits?
Yes, I believe it does provide some benefits, especially if the desktop is disposable. But if it's persistent, those benefits start to fall away a little bit. But if it's kind of a disposable desktop, then a lot of those artifacts that might be there do have a tendency to sort of fade away, turn into heat and evaporate off the heat sink in the data center somewhere. And so, yeah, I believe there are benefits. Ironically, it's kind of going full circle. We started off with thin clients and centralized computing. We're kind of making full circle back to that. We got any old timers on here that working in mainframes with rack F. You're like, we tried to tell you guys. But yeah, I do actually believe there are some benefits to that sort of virtual desktop environment. I won't say it eliminates everything though. And I would say that one of the best questions to ask yourself is, if an attacker had a keylogger, even if it's running on the non-administrative desktop somewhere, would they be able to compromise the system? So you're going to want to include, strong multi-factor authentication with something like that as well. But I do believe there are some benefits in the grand scheme of things, sure.
Great. And then the last question we have time for today is, any suggestions on best steps to protect at least workstations in a better manner given all these latest vulnerabilities? That's from Claudia.
Yeah, good question. It's nice to have something to focus on. And, they have the critical controls from the Center for Internet Security. Well, the Australian Signals Director at the ASD down in Australia, they did a big study on a whole bunch of breaches that they had suffered. And these were like targeted nation state attacks, not just, other stuff. And they came up with 4 things, okay, that people should do. First one, implement application whitelisting, okay, on the desktops. Second and third things really had to do with patching. So the second thing was patching all your client software, including Adobe and Flash and all the client software. Third thing was OS patches. Make sure it's up to date on the latest and greatest version of Windows, first of all, and then all the patches and updates and upgrades have been applied. And then the fourth thing was restricting administrative rights. Because a lot of the more advanced types of attacks that I was illustrating there with Mimikatz and Kiwi and things, many of those actually require elevated privileges. And to fully compromise a system, they need that very often. And so restricting admin rights is yet another huge one. I would add one more thing to that, and that is increasing visibility into your workstation VLANs. That's a huge blind spot for most organizations. The only visibility they really have a lot of times is whatever their endpoint security suite gives them, which is something. But hackers are real good about getting around that stuff, especially APTs. They'll make sure before they ever deploy that it's going to bypass your endpoint. So I recommend increasing your visibility by doing things like capturing NetFlow data in your user VLANs. And you might explore implementing private VLANs, which actually isolate each one of the switch ports from each other. Not all of you will be able to implement it because of dependencies, but wherever you can, that can be incredibly helpful in addition to those other recommendations. And then one more thing real quick. If it's a Windows system, you might just want to take a look at software restriction policies called AppLocker these days. You might explore the idea of rolling out a relatively simple AppLocker policy that only allows things to execute from the Windows directory, where the OS stuff is, and the program files directory, where legitimate programs that the administrators have installed live, and then block it from everywhere else, because you might be surprised at how much that blocks and how much malware that actually prevents. It's relatively easy, built-in, native. You don't need a third-party tool. It also generates event logs you can send back to your SIM, and you'll know if somebody attempts to execute something, either from a USB stick or they download it or get hit by drive-by download that ends up in the temporary browser folder. A lot of the places where it actually ends up, it just won't execute because of that simple SRP. So that's another thing you might look at. So yes, anybody else? Any other?
Actually, Bryce, I just wanted to say I hope everyone gets a chance to take a class from you one day. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming too. Sorry, I really try to stay on the hour, but man, there's so much to talk about. So
there absolutely is. Thank you. And I will turn this over to Carol to end for today. Any last comment, Bryce, before we go?
no, just keep up the fight, embrace the chaos, and know that what you do matters, and just keep it up. Just keep it up.
Thanks, Bryce.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bryce, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.